people. What's not clear about that? What's not clear about that? In order for Abraham to save his own son, an innocent sacrifice had to be offered in Isaac's place. What's not clear about that? Blood sacrifice is the only way. Even in the books of Moses, Leviticus 17, the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I've given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. It is the blood by reason of the life that makes atonement. It is the blood by reason of the life that makes atonement. Every Jew knew that sin brought death and that God would provide a substitute. The substitute was pictured, but the substitute had never come. They knew that none of their works, none of their own achievements or religious activities could take away their sin. But at the same time, they knew that there was no final, sufficient sacrifice who would ever come forward. There was no perfect sacrifice. But all of that pointed to the Messiah. So how were they going to get the suffering and the glory connected? Verse 27, beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, and in all the hagiographa, the third part, he explained to them the things concerning himself. Boy, would I love to have been there for that lesson. He went into all the sections of the Old Testament, from Moses to Malachi, 39 books, and he taught the things concerning himself. He traces his coming, his suffering, his resurrection, and his glory through the whole Old Testament. This is Christ the expositor, expositing the only Bible he ever owned, ever had, ever read, explaining the things concerning himself in all the Scriptures. He grounds them in the Old Testament prophecies of Messiah, which then become the foundation on which their faith can stand. What did he say? What did he talk about? Where did he go? Well, let me make some suggestions. You can just listen. If I were to do a survey of things that he might have used, I would say maybe he started in Genesis 3:15 when he identified himself as the seed of the woman who would be bruised, who would be wounded, meaning his death, but he would crush the serpent's head. Maybe he went to Genesis 3:21 and said that when God killed an animal and used the skin of that animal to cover the guilt of Adam and Eve, that was a picture of the fact that he would be the sacrifice to provide the covering for sinners. Maybe he went into Genesis 4:4 and said that the true sacrifice, the acceptable sacrifice offered by Abel, was a picture of his acceptable sacrifice to come, a sacrifice of blood and death. Maybe he went to Genesis 6, 7, and 8, the story of the flood, and said that he is the true ark of safety who delivers his people through the waters of judgment. Maybe he went to the 8th chapter of Genesis, verses 20 and 22, to show that he is the one laid on the altar after Noah came out and offered a sacrifice to God, a picture of him. I'm sure that all references to atonement in the Old Testament he demonstrated, pictured him. Maybe he stopped in Isaiah chapter 50 and verse 6 and said of himself, I am the one who gave his back to the smiters and his cheeks to those who plucked his beard and covered his face with spit. And maybe he went to Zechariah 12:10, and I am the one, he said, who was pierced. And when they look at me, there will be opened a fountain of cleansing for sin. And I'm pretty sure he went to Isaiah 53, aren't you? And told them he was the one wounded for their transgressions, bruised for their iniquities, chastised for their peace. He was the lamb led to slaughter. And he may have even pulled in some of the details. Or Psalm 69:9, which says he would be hated for no reason. Or Psalm 41:9, that he would be betrayed by a friend. Or Zechariah 11:12, that he would be sold for 30 pieces of silver, which he was. Or Zechariah 11:13, that the money would be then taken and thrown on the temple floor and then used to buy a potter's field, all of which was said of him and all of which came true. Maybe he took them back into Isaiah 53:7 and reminded them that when the sheep was slaughtered, he wouldn't open his mouth to defend himself, and he had done that. According to Matthew 27:12, he didn't answer. Maybe he looked later in Isaiah 53 at that verse that says he would be included with the criminals, numbered with the transgressors in his death. And there he was with a criminal on each side of him. Maybe he took them to Psalm 34:20, which says, "Not a bone of his body will be broken," and none was, because he was already dead. Maybe he went back into Isaiah 53, pointed them to the fact that he would be buried with the rich, and he ended up in the tomb of a rich man, Joseph of Arimathea. Surely he went to Psalm 16, because Psalm 16 says that when he dies, his body would not decay. He would not suffer corruption, but he would be raised from the dead. Psalm 16:10. His ascension is in Psalm 68. His coronation is in Psalm 2 and Psalm 110, and those are just samples. The lesson must have been a staggering lesson. Sweeping lesson. And he gave it to those two men. How could they have been so ignorant when there's so much there? How could they have been so foolish when the Old Testament was so much about him? Sometimes it can get boring sitting in a class. I don't think that one was boring. I don't know how long it lasted, but I will tell you, a fire was being lit inside of them, the likes of which they had never experienced, because everything was making sense. Everything. Everything. He went inside the Old Testament to explain himself. He went deep down into the details of the Old Testament to clarify their vision of him. And their eyes were opened. Their eyes were opened. For the first time in their lives, they understood the Old Testament. And it is at that moment that their faith found its inviolable, immovable foundation. The Lord was alive from the dead, and so was the Old Testament. That same day, 7 miles away, meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, the 11 are gathered together, and these guys are so excited that they just bolt, though it's late. They say, "It's so late, Jesus, don't travel, come stay with us for the night." But they're so excited, they bolt for Jerusalem. They arrive there, and